Okay, welcome everybody to this webinar. We are here today to discuss newcomer families and how to welcome them. This is the first session of 5. The first session, as we all know, is titled Getting to Know Families. In the next one on Thursday, we'll be learning more about how to access resources, basic needs information, how to navigate state and local resources, as well as federal ones. So today we're going simple. We're doing introductions. We're, getting to know not only the families, but also each other, including how we're doing in the districts, what's going on in different situations and areas, and also just more broadly, just kind of gathering everything and coming to a place where everybody is on the same page on what newcomer families are, who they are, where they're coming from, how we can do the most that we can to support them and navigate the systems that everybody is in together. So I'm gonna start by introducing myself. My name is Ann Ting. I use she, they pronouns. I am a senior trainer and family engagement manager at the Federation for Children with Special Needs, also known as FCSN. I see a lot of familiar faces here today that were also here on our February 15th webinar, which is very exciting. Hello again. I am a Taiwanese person with glasses, medium-ish black hair. I am wearing a green sweater, and my Zoom background is blurred. Very, very nice to meet you. My background is in education and public policy. And before I get to everybody here, because we do have like a smaller team of folks today, which is great for discussions, I would also like to just generally introduce FCSN as well. You'll be seeing me going from here to here on multiple screens because I have multiple screens, so I will be doing this back and forth thing. But if you speak, I am listening to you. So in terms of who FCSN is, we are an umbrella organization for many different programs that support families. We're best known for our work supporting special education families to navigate the special education process and everybody's roles within it. But over this course of time, we have built on this expertise to become a resource on family engagements, and also just any kind of issue regarding family engagements that affects all families and not just those with children with disabilities. And that has just kind of naturally transgressed over to the immigrant population, the multilingual student population. And we also host a variety of trainings, such as this one on improving family engagement practices in schools and also in community-based organizations. So this program here today, I've mentioned before, is a series of 5. We're meeting for 2 hours each time to discuss the needs of newcomer families and just go like in a very holistic manner of explaining what that means for different folks. So it's really great to be here, like I mentioned before, with everybody here today. I'd like to just kind of pause sharing for a second and ask if folks would like to introduce themselves. We'll be seeing a lot of each other over the next 2.5 weeks, particularly because we will be doing a lot of interactive work together. We'll be discussing, we'll be kind of analyzing everybody's districts and structures and any needs that folks have, any questions that folks have. It's not really just like a one-on-one conversation between you and me. There's also going to be a lot of opportunities for folks to speak to one another, to network, and also to just kind of have a better understanding of districts beyond your own, on how people are dealing with issues that are arising and how places that folks are fighting may be of support for others. So, like I mentioned, I'm going to stop sharing for a second so that we can just go ahead and introduce ourselves. On the slide before, I put down a couple of placeholders for folks to just kind of introduce firstly their name and their title, their school district and their community that they come from, as well as any experiences that folks have with newcomers. So I'm just gonna stop talking for a hot second and let folks just kind of gather their thoughts and see if anybody feels comfortable in this space to just speak up and share if we can.
Hi, my name is Joan Federico. I work for Malden Public Schools. I'm the manager of the Welcome Center. This is where we do all the registrations, so we're the first point of entry that all these newcomers see when they come in. I do have staff that speak multiple languages, which helps. And we've just seen an overwhelming amount of newcomers, not necessarily people in hotels. We only have one hotel that is full right now, but just people coming from the border, they're staying with people, they're doubling up. We've had several hundred since January. Thank you.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing, Joan. That's really helpful to hear. Um, and I'm sure that we'll be talking more about, aside from what folks are seeing, also how the numbers that folks are seeing, how people are integrating folks into the systems, and what is overwhelming, what is not. So thank you, Joan, for sharing. Is there anybody else that would also like to just kind of introduce themselves and use this time to just, spread word of whatever is going on in their district?
Hi there. My name is Erin Dunham. I'm from Wilmington Public Schools. We do not have hotels or settings that could accommodate newcomers, so we have much fewer. But that does sort of pose different challenges because we're trying to sort of figure out and educate staff in different buildings on how to sort of manage and understand and support students.
Thank you, Erin, for sharing. It's really helpful to hear. And I do remember your name, seeing it on a lot of the registrations. So I'm really excited to see you, and to see you in the future. I think we do have, space for one or two more folks to share if they'd like to. So I'm just gonna wait and see if anybody wants to share.
Hi, I'll share. My name is Jeanette Velez. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for Everett Public Schools. So I oversee the Parent Information Center and also the family liaisons in the district. We do have a hotel with newcomers, but every day we have newcomers coming through our doors, whether they're in a hotel or just doubled up. And I've seen a difference of where they're coming from before. It was a lot from El Salvador, Honduras, but now we're seeing from Nicaragua, Guatemala, a lot from Colombia as well, besides our Haitian Creole family. So it's been a shift, but we're definitely been nonstop here in Everett. We're very busy. We do everything by appointment, and it's tough when people call and they have to wait a week or almost two to get an appointment, but that's how busy we are. And my staff here is very diverse. So fortunately, I'm able to have Portuguese, Haitian Creole, Spanish speakers on board to help the families.
Thank you, Jeanette, for sharing. That's really, really helpful to hear, especially when you were highlighting what types of demographics of newcomers are coming into your region. Um, we'll be sharing a lot more later on some data that's public information from state and federal sources so that folks also have like a broader idea of what types of folks are coming in and who they are and all the good stuff. But it's really helpful to hear specifically what districts folks are going towards. As we all know, it kind of shifts and changes a lot, so it's just helpful in the current moment, especially to know. So thank you, Jeanette, for sharing. I think we have time, as I mentioned before, for one more person. So if anybody else would like to share, I think we're just going to end at that and then move on.
Hi, my name is Carmel Pollo, and I'm also working at the Welcome Center. I'm a multilingual staff, and I would say, in follow-up to what John had said, we are receiving newcomers every day. It's the new topic.
Thank you for sharing, Carmel. I hear you. I know that it's been difficult to just kind of have everybody come in and just not have enough resources in the moment, and that it's difficult to really do a lot of these strategies with a preventative mindset. Now that mostly the only sort of notice that we have is mostly geared towards us being able to use reactive strategies. So thank you, Carmel, for sharing. This is all very helpful to hear, not just for everybody here, but also specifically for FCSN so that we can cater a lot more of our programs more specifically towards everybody's needs. So with that in mind, also, if you ever during the course of this presentation, during the course of Thursdays and beyond, have anything that you'd like to share with us directly, feel free to email me. My email is on the presentation slides that you will also be receiving after this presentation. And aside from that, if you would like any support, just generally within FCSN, we are also here to help as well. Doesn't necessarily always have to be about newcomer families. We have a variety of programs. So thank you all for sharing. It's so nice to hear from you. And I'm going to continue to share my screen again and move on with the presentation now that we all have like a general understanding of who we are and just kind of ground ourselves in the space together. Please give me a hot second while I do that. I like to think that I am tech savvy, but occasionally, like today, I am not. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so thank you all again for sharing. I am going to move on to the next slide. I will be giving slide descriptors at the same time as well while I'm sharing so that folks can also follow along to the slide descriptions. But if I ever so happen to miss a slide description, feel free to just unpause and unmute and let me know and I will get to that. Okay. So to begin today, and before we view the agenda, I'd like to also just take some time to do a session breakdown of what the incoming sessions are going to look like. So on the slide, it's titled Session Breakdown. There are 3 lines of text, and everything describes the session formatting. So for an hour and 30 minutes, everything here will be recorded. We'll have the session content, just interactive elements like what we did earlier. We'll integrate discussions into what we're doing, and we'll leave a little bit of time at the end to do the feedback form together, which is going to be very helpful for us to create and just kind of develop and improve the upcoming webinars and sessions as well. Not only this 10-hour series that we're doing today, but also the ones happening in April and May. I did see a couple of folks sign up in the last 2 days or so as well, aside from a bunch of other folks signing up in the months before that. So thank you for doing so. Excited to be seeing you again in April and May. But this will be critical for us to really understand and cater this information to specifically what folks need and who's going to be coming. So that 1.5 hours will be specifically for that. The last 30 minutes will be a handout focus time in which folks will receive through email and also through the Zoom chat here, specific handouts curated for each session. And what these handouts are going to do is to just kind of create a more personalized and cultivated view of the information that we're presenting here today and what is happening in your own districts. We are very, very aware that each district is going through very different circumstances. Some may have a lot of folks coming in, some may not at the moment, but are expecting people coming in. Or, we've also heard through our community of practices as well that there are districts where there are a lot of newcomers and they're not necessarily moving out of the districts, but they are actually moving through schools, which is another difficult sort of situation to handle as well. So we are keeping this in mind and leaving some time for folks to do these handouts together. This is going to be a space that is not recorded. And we are purposefully making this format like this within this 2-hour span so that we are not going to, it's going to be less likely for us to run into dismissal. And we know that in the next coming sessions from 2 to 4 may be difficult for some folks to get to. Some people might have to leave in the middle and miss out on information. So this is a sort of space and opportunity for folks to do asynchronous work. If folks have to leave at the end of all of the session content and at the end of the recording, feel free to do so. And in order to receive the PDP points for the PDP certificate for all of the 10 hours that we are spending together today and also in the next 2.5 weeks on all of this information, all folks would have to do is to return the handouts back to FCSN, specifically to me. You can do that either at the end of these sessions, and I will be here throughout the whole time and an extra couple of minutes afterwards as well. Or something else that you can do is also to just email me the handouts of that week, and I will be sending folks a reminder about these handouts at the end of every week. So it would be really amazing because we're doing things like we're building, this context up bit by bit, that we can get all of this information done like within the week. So the first week we can just get all of it done together at the end. And the second week, the same thing. And then the last session together holistically. And then I'll just leave some time at the end of the third week for folks to just kind of trickle in and give out the handouts to me as well. But this is generally going to be what this format is going to look like. During this handout focus time, we'll be also breaking out into 2 groups. The first group is for people to focus if they would just like some quiet time. And I'll be in another space on the Zoom call for folks to just come in and do some Q&A. If they want to meet with me directly to just kind of share what's going on, if they want to just, ask for more information on a couple of things that we're sharing, this is a great space to do so. And yeah, that is the entirety of what the session breakdowns are looking like. I just gave you a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions on how the agenda is going to be working in the next 5 sessions? I'm going to give everybody a couple of seconds to just kind of gather their thoughts and speak up if they have any. Okay. It's seeming like everybody's a-okay with this formatting, so I see a nod or two, so I'm going to move on. The last thing that is more closely to just kind of housekeeping business today that I'd like to go through with everybody is to discuss the time for when we are meeting. I'm going to stop recording for a little bit so that we can just do this poll really quickly, and then continue recording in a little bit afterwards. Okay, poll complete. We are going to move on. So now that we finished finally going through the session formatting, let's go through the actual agenda for today. Our session today, as we all know, is titled Getting to Know Families, and we're starting off with understanding context, which includes history, demographics, and systems. This will be a fair amount of this webinar. And it's going to be very, very helpful for later on when we're discussing strategies, when we're thinking about what everything means, that we have this context in mind. But more importantly, it's also a really great use of our time in order to get everybody collectively on the same page. Because as I mentioned before, a lot of folks have different experiences with newcomer families. So that's why we're doing this first. I will be as comprehensive as possible during this time, but given that we do have limitations on time specifically, I'll be going through just a couple of points that are critical to understanding newcomer families in the space before moving on to introducing language access and cultural sensitivity. We'll be following up in the next session as well with resources, but to truly understand where our newcomer families are coming from, we must also aim to understand this context with language access and cultural sensitivity in mind. We'll be following that afterwards with a discussion on understanding cultural backgrounds together and breaking this down more specifically into challenges that folks face within the school systems, not just for the newcomer families, but also for you. We'll lastly be regrouping and talking about solutions and building knowledge together before we do our closing and move forward into asynchronous work time. as well as the Q&A. So let's move on from there. Okay, I would first like to start off by introducing everybody to this diagram on the slide. This slide is a 4-set Venn diagram with 4 circles overlapping to create belonging in the very middle. To the right of this diagram are 3 number bullet points, and I will be referring to this diagram as the belonging diagram here and also in future sessions. It's going to be something that FCSN is going to implement into a lot of our material in the future as well. So you will probably be seeing a lot of this Venn diagram. Currently, we will be using this specifically to discuss the 4 milestones on the charts that are critical to creating belonging for newcomer families as they enter new schools and districts. So I'm going to give everybody a broad overview of what this diagram is before we move on. Just so that we all understand the context of why this was created and why this is important and how to utilize it to the best of our abilities. So the top milestone is understanding context with an icon of a light bulb. This is important in a lot of areas, and it's the milestone that we're going to be focusing on primarily today. In terms of this, this is where we go into terminology, law, history, and also demographics. In terms of terminology, this may mean understanding the language barriers and also just generally terms that people use and newcomer families also commonly use. In terms of law, this means familiarity with relevant laws that regard immigrant rights, education, integration into communities, what all of that good stuff means, and as well as history, which is just like broadly this awareness of the historical context of immigration in the community, more largely in the country, and its impact on schooling, especially today, especially in Massachusetts. And lastly, I mentioned demographics, and in this manner, it means knowledge of demographics of newcomer families, including their countries of origin. And this could also mean languages spoken, socioeconomic status, all of that stuff that we like to keep and just, keep in mind in terms of understanding cultural context. Moving clockwise, which we'll be doing a lot just generally when we look at this, we'll be moving clockwise. Let's look at accessing basic needs with a house icon. This means ensuring access to education, firstly, and this could mean providing information about enrollment procedures, school resources, and also support services, which I know a lot of folks already do. This could also mean addressing housing and food insecurity. And an example of this is identifying resources for affordable housing and also food assistance programs, which a lot of communities, again, also have, which is great. Lastly, this also means healthcare access. And this, in terms of that, means connecting families with healthcare services and also insurance options, which are out there, but a lot of this information, unfortunately, is not always consolidated. Moving again clockwise, we are going downwards to respecting language and culture, and this milestone is depicted by an icon of 2 people talking. So this means language support in terms of offering bilingual services, interpreters, translated materials, liaisons, language acquisition programs, and more broadly, cultural brokering, which we will be discussing in April webinars in the far future or in the near, depending on how you view time. Secondly, this also means cultural competence. And what that really means is just kind of having a broad understanding of what a lot of the cultural diversity and backgrounds of folks mean and what that means in terms of communication with staff, communication with families, communications with partners, as well as beliefs, cultural practices, and traditions. And that also very naturally leads us to cultural diversity. Lastly, the very last milestone that we have on the screen here is partnering with communities. this can mean community engagements, such as building relationships with your local immigrant organizations, faith-based institutions, depending on, which newcomer families more like naturally gravitate towards a particular faith or not, as well as cultural centers. This could also mean parental involvement, so working with your local LPACs and your local CPACs, very important. Um, so being able to create this sort of power dynamic shift so that we are more equals in the situation where parents can also have the opportunity to make decisions for their kiddos. And to be involved in school activities and decision-making processes. Lastly, collaborative initiatives, and in this case, it means just generally partnering with communities to develop programs and resources that support newcomer families' success. So all of this together, intersecting, creates belonging. It's a more holistic view on what belonging means, especially in the context of newcomer families. So we refer to each of these circles as milestones because they are important goals to keep in mind while we assess what the families need and what schools can provide. The milestones themselves are not numbered. You'll note that I will try my very hardest to not say any numbers while I list or label these milestones as well. Because firstly, there is no priority on which milestone needs to be achieved first. Um, there is no one sort of like solution fits all sort of narrative when we're talking about welcoming newcomer families because first we simply, as everybody knows, we don't have the time, but also a lot of the resources that we have varies very greatly. So we do not number any of these milestones because you could be on partnering with communities as a milestone while also simultaneously needing more resources for basic needs. And this is going to be useful as well for placing why it is important to need all four at the same time. We don't necessarily need to always have all four, but it is important that we strive towards achieving all four in order to just have like this bigger, broader sense of what belonging looks like and to make it really lasting and sustainable in the communities that you're with, regardless of whether the kiddos and the families come and go. So what we do want to do as well is to also create a flow to how we think about these milestones as action items, and not to be able also to just generally assess where we land currently with our newcomer families on this diagram. And I mentioned this before, but we will be doing this later together. So the three goals that we do have in mind, I'm referring to the numbered bullet points on the slide now, are to firstly increase knowledge on immigration and refugee backgrounds, which is what we're doing primarily today. Secondly, to put in practice strategies for classrooms, designs, and also partnerships, which we'll be doing a lot of in the next 2 sessions. And thirdly, to instill this achievement-oriented, but also relationships-focused mindset in school settings. From the last seminar that we did, that a lot of folks went to, you'll hear me speak of the word asset-based a lot when we're speaking of this achievement-oriented and also relationships-based focused mindset, because to do both of those things means to really speak and communicate with families and also with each other while thinking of newcomer families and their arrival as something that is asset-based and asset-oriented. So we'll be coming back to this later, but I would like to also just examine generally what we're going to be doing with this diagram specifically today so that it doesn't get very confusing later on. So, like I mentioned before, understanding context is going to be the most important milestone to get today as part of the topic of getting to know families. And the rest of the sessions will be more closely geared towards each milestone as well. I've sent everybody an email with the agenda of all 5 sessions. The very last one is the most interactive of all of these sessions, where we're going to be trying to just figure out a way together and use different strategies to retain all 4 of these milestones together in a cohesive action plan. We've heard a lot of feedback I just want to mention this again, that we have heard a lot of feedback from folks saying that either districts don't have a lot of newcomer families in the moment, or that districts have been working on newcomer family issues for a really, really long time, or they're just suddenly getting bursts of folks in and out of the system. So I'm keeping this in mind too, as I'm like going through this material and also breaking things down so that we are all on the same page. And we will work on that starting with breaking down this belonging diagram now that we've gone through just generally the gist of it together. The next slide is also going to be this diagram, but it's going to be more descriptive. Feel free right now to also screenshot this if you like this right now while we're going through the rest of this material. You'll be seeing it again later on as well, but this is here for you to just generally have it with you. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about how we're examining the belonging diagram, not generally and holistically, but also more specifically and targeted towards integration centers on each side of the circles. So this slide has this diagram, but with arrows with descriptions pointing towards the intersections of milestones. And aside from these arrows, let's also just generally take some time to delve deeper into these intersections. And knowing how the milestones can correlate exactly will be very helpful to understanding both where to place your school and district's progress on the diagram, and also just generally where to proceed from here. So we start first with understanding context, if folks can see my mouse, and its integration with partnering with communities, accessing basic needs, but also generally as well respecting language and culture. I'll be saying just a couple of examples of this because I want to also be aware of time. So the way that understanding context and intersects with accessing basic needs could be on understanding the demographics of newcomer families, and how that helps school districts and also us identify specific basic needs. And an example is knowing that a significant portion of newcomer families come from low income backgrounds, may prompt us to prioritize access to free or reduced price meal programs if possible. So that's one example. There are many more. But the reason why I'm bringing up examples in this space together with you is to just kind of kickstart this analyzing process of people being able to redirect these examples to the work that they're doing and their lived experience, as well as think of different ones. In terms of an example of how this intersects with respecting language and culture, knowing the cultural significance of certain holidays or rituals can also help us create a more inclusive environment where traditions are acknowledged and respected, and not just generally as a system where we acknowledge that it exists, but also in the classroom with other kiddos and their peers, and being able to just kind of represent that with them. So that's also going to be really important as well, to just creating a sense of belonging, starting from the kiddo towards the families. And lastly, in terms of also moving in again clockwise, in terms of how this intersects with partnering with communities. An example is that if there is a community center that provides immigration support services, understanding the role of that in the community would help school districts collaborate more effectively with it. So all of this comes together to create a more inclusive and holistic understanding of why things are happening in the community, why people need things, the things that they need, and also generally what respecting language and culture and really promoting DEI initiatives in the school looks like from a newcomer family standpoint. Moving on to accessing basic needs, an example of how that intersects with understanding context, with accessing basic needs being the more primary figure in this relationship, is that knowing the requirements. For example, I know a lot of folks here have a lot of experience with this, but knowing the requirements of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act would help school districts ensure that newcomer families experiencing homelessness can also access educational services. And this is also really important in terms of other acts that we haven't even talked about yet. So this also relates very closely with partnering with communities in that collaborating with local community organizations that addresses basic needs, as well as legal context, ensures that newcomer families can receive this comprehensive support beyond their education, and it helps them center and focus on what they need to do in school. I'm moving on really quickly towards respecting language and culture. An important context that an example that I wanted to bring up, aside from all the other ones that I have already, is how, for example, intersecting with understanding context would mean knowing the historical context of migration patterns. And this really helps us understand the diverse cultural backgrounds of students and tailor that support accordingly. We know that there are different types of demographics entering different regions of Massachusetts, and knowing the patterns and being able to, I know it's very difficult to be preventative in this type of work right now, but being able to just kind of understand who is going to be coming in before they actually do is going to be so helpful and so impactful. So even just having this basic and knowledge and foundation of how and where these statistics are is going to be huge. I'm going to share one last thing before we move on because I am aware of the time restraints that we have today. But in terms of partnering with communities and how that intersects with respecting language and culture, um, an example that I wanted to say was how partnering with a local immigrant serving organization can facilitate language interpretation services during school events or meetings. So instead of also focusing, which is very valid, focusing on just what the states and also the federal resources that are available can do for us. Also focusing on finding community partners that already have this, context and have consolidated a lot more information is going to be helpful. A lot of the times, folks that are able to do a lot of this cultural brokering work, this translation work and interpretation work is already there, but they may be doing other things in the community that do not already intersect with education holistically. So that is a really good example that I wanted to bring up of what partnering with communities may look like while intersecting with respecting language and culture. Okay. I am going to move on to the next slide. I'm just going to give everybody 1 or 2 seconds more to just kind of look at this and just kind of burn it into everybody's eyeballs before we move on to another topic. Okay. Moving onwards. Now, after hearing me speak for quite a long time, I'd like to move on towards understanding context. This is the title of the slide, as well as a subtitle of our history. There is one line of text as well as an insert of a video that we will be watching together, as well as, I forgot to say, citations at the very bottom. If you see any citations at the bottom of any slides, they are hyperlinked for the presentation that you'll be getting later on, so that you can also go in and look over this information yourself if you'd like to learn more and if you are curious. So now that we are very, very familiar with the belonging diagram, let's begin talking more about the first milestone, understanding context in relations to this presentation. We begin with a brief understanding into how a lot of newcomer families are arriving to the States. We all know that Massachusetts has a very long history of refugee resettlement, with various waves of refugees arriving from different parts of the world. And understanding this history, as well as the process for how refugees arrive into the country, can provide insights into not only the diverse backgrounds and experiences of refugee families in the state, but also their experiences already way before they even begin the resettling process. One specific statistic that I wanted to share before we watch this video is that about 1 in every 6 Massachusetts residents is foreign born, and that specifically is 17.6%. It's huge. This is a statistic collected from the Mira Coalition, hyperlinked below for you to look at later if you would like. And just before we watch this, I just want also to add on that since we are experiencing rising waves of newcomer families in Massachusetts, we do need to get started on getting everybody on the same page about the general process of how refugee families arrive in the States, and we can do so by reviewing this video. This video, I wanted to give everybody a quick background of it, is from Switchboard, which is an organization that serves as a resource hub for refugee service providers, and it explains who refugees are, how they arrive in the States, and it is all done through the narrative of a person with lived experience. So we're going to watch this. I am going to put it on if I can. Okay. Please excuse the technology for a second. Okay. I have figured out a way to do this.
My name is Rashawn. I'm from Eritrea, a country in Africa. My family was forced to flee to Sudan when violence broke out during Eritrea's struggle for independence. Ultimately, our family received refugee status and resettled in the United States. So who are refugees? And how do refugees receive the rare opportunity to rebuild their lives?
I'm sorry, is this blurry for folks?
No, it looks good.
No, it looks
Okay,
good.
great.
It's fine.
Thank you. I was a little confused from my end, but thank you.
In the US. A refugee is a person who is outside his or her country and is unable or unwilling to return because of a well-founded fear of persecution. This fear may be based on race, religion, nationality, social group, and/or political opinion. Many refugees face the possibility of being killed if they don't flee. Of the millions of refugees worldwide, far less than 1% resettle in a new country. Some decide to return to their home countries, and some are able to integrate into the host countries where they initially sought refuge. But for many people, resettlement is the only option. For my family, due to the outbreak of violence, it was not possible to stay in Sudan or return home to Eritrea. The only path to safety was to resettle in a new country. The United States has historically been a leader in refugee resettlement. Each year, the U.S. President determines the annual refugee admission ceiling in consultation with Congress. The U.S. also welcomes other people fleeing persecution. These humanitarian immigrants include those granted asylum, special immigrant visa holders from Afghanistan and Iraq, and Cuban and Haitian entrants. Many organizations and agencies work together to keep the U.S. refugee admissions program safe and secure. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, referred my family for resettlement to the United States. Resettlement Support Centers, or RSCs, are run by nonprofit organizations in partnership with the U.S. government. In our RSC interviews, we explain the story of how and why we fled Eritrea. Our family was also interviewed by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. It was their role to decide if we met the qualifications for resettlement. Throughout this process, we underwent rigorous security vetting, including screening by the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the State Department. Refugees are screened more thoroughly than any other type of entrant to the United States. From the time a refugee is first referred for resettlement, it can take many months or even years before they arrive in the U.S. After this long process, our family was determined to be eligible for resettlement. We were so happy to finally receive the chance to move to a safe home. But first, we needed to complete medical screening, receive immunizations, and attend cultural orientation. Once all overseas vetting is complete, eligible refugees are approved for travel to the U.S. in a process coordinated by the International Organization for Migration. Until this moment, many refugees don't know which new city or town they will call home. Refugees are resettled in states and communities across the U.S. Resettlement agencies are nonprofit organizations that are funded by the U.S. government and private donors to help support refugees when they reach the United States. When we arrived, resettlement agency staff met us at the airport. They brought us to our new apartment, which was prepared with basic furniture, household supplies, and food. Federal agencies coordinate with states to make resources and services available to newly arrived refugees and other humanitarian immigrants. The United States funds many initial services through the State Department. Others are funded through the Office of Refugee Resettlement within the Department of Health and Human Services. Resettlement agencies, state and county agencies, community-based organizations, schools, and healthcare providers all work together to provide these services. Local communities, businesses, and faith-based organizations also offer support, including by volunteering their time, providing donations, and helping to create a welcoming environment for their new neighbors. With help from our resettlement agency and their partners, my siblings and I enrolled in school. My parents signed up for English language classes, received work authorizations, and applied for jobs. Other refugee services include opportunities to improve economic well-being by building personal finance skills, increasing career readiness, preparing for higher education, and even launching small businesses. Refugees also participate in health and wellness programs, including support with accessing healthcare. Special services available to youth include family, academic, and mentoring activities. Elders receive additional integration supports. My parents secured employment shortly after arriving, and eventually they were able to buy a home for our family. After 1 year in the United States, refugees apply to become permanent residents. Around 5 years after arrival, they may apply to become American citizens. Refugees are your neighbors, business owners in your community, and your children's classmates. As for me, I am now a member of the switchboard team. Every day, I help improve services that enable newcomers to thrive, just like me and my family.
Okay. So that was a holistic understanding for folks to just kind of understand where newcomers are coming from, what the refugee process is like, and just have more context on the vetting that folks have to go through in order to arrive at a place of resettlement. So thank you for bearing with me while I figure out technology, but I am going to move on with sharing. Still see the screen okay? Oh, we went all the way back. Okay. Apologies, my Wi-Fi is a little bit glitchy, but I think we're okay. We're moving on to the slide on understanding context and our demographics. Does everybody see that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
I see some nods. Amazing. So this slide, like I mentioned, is titled Understanding Context. In terms of our demographics, there are two charts on them. Below the two charts are sources that this data is gathered from. The first chart to your left is titled The Number of Foreign-Born Massachusetts Residents. This is gathered both from state demographics data from the Migration Policy Institute as well as the census, which is why you'll see gaps that are slightly larger in the year part of everything. And this indicates that the number of foreign-born Massachusetts residents has risen very significantly in the last couple decades. I've already mentioned this before, so that it should really come to no surprise that since 1990, this number has doubled. But of a fraction of this most recent wave of newcomer families from Haiti is depicted also on the charts to your right. In the last 10 years, starting from 2014, which is why on the bottom, you will see the numbers 1 to 10. This represents the years 2014 all the way to 2023 in the last 10 years. That the number of Haitian newcomer arrivals that were met at US borders has risen to 80K, with the increase spiking in the last 4 years more significantly. And this data is gathered from the Immigrant Enforcement and Legal Processes monthly tables from the Department of Homeland Security. Most of this data is live, so when you go in, if you like to look at it by yourself, you'll see that a lot of this information is gathered monthly. In the next slide, you'll see information that is as recent as January 2024. And since it is going to almost be the end of February, we'll be able to see data for that in the next coming weeks as well. Moving onwards. This is another chart to your left on the summary of US refugee admissions. This is gathered from the Department of State, and this is recent data gathered from the last 4 months. These are sorting newcomers into categories by the regions, firstly, Africa, secondly, East Asia, thirdly, Europe and Central Asia, fourthly, Latin America and the Caribbean, and lastly, Near East and South Asia as a general region. So the numbers are extremely large, as you can see, and focus on the last 4 months, excluding February 2024, reason as to what I've explained earlier. Next to that, to the right, is a pie chart of the statistic that we first began with when we watched the video together on how 1 in every 6 Massachusetts residents is foreign-born. So this is a very good comparison side to side of our current situation. This is here to demonstrate that while newcomer waves do come and go, the numbers of newcomer folks in this area, however, and also in the states at large, is going to be changing constantly, and more importantly, may not always be the demographics that we hear most often about in our circles or in the media. And discussions recently, as of February 2024, has been widely on the Haitian wave of newcomer families. But I also like to bring some statistics to the table that focus on other folks that have also been arriving in Massachusetts. And this is all data for Massachusetts specifically. So in January 2024, which is the last month alone, there has been 2,073 newcomers from Burma, 4,626 newcomers from Afghanistan, 5,837 newcomers from Syria, and the highest, aside from Haitian newcomers, being 7,408 newcomers from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And these numbers are gathered by the Refugee Processing Center's Refugee Admissions Reports. And this highlights refugee arrivals by state and nationality. It's very clearly laid out if you like to go in and take a look for yourself as well. And again, many of the sources that I cite are already hyperlinked, so you can go through this data if you would like to learn more about the presentation afterwards when it is shared to you. And I'm saying all of this information to just say that newcomer families do come from many different places and have a variety of experiences, that both in their immigration process itself, but also in how they resettle in the States. And the only thing that can be said to be the same for all families coming through is the refugee process, um, that and how they are rigorously screened by federal agencies such as USCIS before they are allowed to even set foot in local communities. And thus, the ways that we welcome these newcomer families, although we can use the belonging diagram, holistically cannot always be the same. So these are just some numbers for folks to think about while we move on. Lastly, as part of understanding context, let's take a look at systems. This slide is titled Understanding Context, Our Systems. There are two blocks of text. The first one on the left is slightly wordier and relates to Plyler v. Doe, which we'll be going through a little bit more later on. And the one block, blue block on the left, are resources that folks can look at, as well as organizations for folks to just kind of figure out ways to navigate collaborating and learning more about our systems. So the page generally is here to emphasize the importance of knowing how systems and legal processes work and why this is important in order to support families and inform them the best that we can, especially if they are not fluent English speakers, which happens a lot of the time. So I wanted to really highlight Plyler v. Doe because it is an important piece of context that folks may not always say. It is also very important to, people really understanding how education federally is supported for all children regardless of status. There is the general definition of it over here, but I'm going to just go through it with you together so that we can just all read it and be on the same page. The Plyler v. Doe from 1982 is a landmark case in the US, and it specifically addresses the rights and educational rights of undocumented immigrant children. So this means that undocumented kids in Massachusetts have the same right to attend public primary and secondary schools, both of them together, as US citizen children and legal resident aliens. So if a newcomer family comes to your district or community but cannot present to you any papers such as birth certificates, they are actually eligible for school regardless. And that is something that we can keep phrasing and wording to folks, so that everybody really understands and knows this information, because it's not always out there. So this ruling ensures that all children, regardless of immigration status, has access to a free public education. There are other laws, regulations, and also policies that are also on the state level and local level that are aimed at supporting families in education and resettlement. Examples that will be going later on in future sessions would include provisions for English language learners, access to support services, and also just generally culturally sustainable education. So we won't be going through any other laws or acts today, but we will be examining this in a bit more on this Thursday, which we'll be talking about in relations to accessing basic needs and resources. I mentioned this before, but to the right, you see a list of organizations. You're more than welcome to search them up while we're speaking. They are also hyperlinked if you want to look at them later. They are all useful organizations and resources that may help your school and district in examining who and what laws are available for folks to support the resettlement process and also registration for schooling. And this includes, translating, cultural brokering, and the like. The last part that I wanted to emphasize here today in regards to understanding context is a bit of terminology. This may also, again, look familiar to folks if you have been to a previous seminar. And I'm bringing this up again with a couple of new terms because it is important for everybody to just know and process together. So in regards the most important word that we need to discuss here today is newcomer. I've said this a lot throughout the session so far, so I'd like to just share a definition. Um, Newcomer is an umbrella term that refers to any foreign-born, non-US citizen students, as well as their families that have recently arrived to the States. We use this interchangeably in future sessions as well with immigrant family, with refugee, and the like. So when we're speaking about this population, we just generally use newcomers. Down to on the bottom row of newcomer family, you'll see asylee. This means somebody that is granted asylum and somebody that is legally allowed to remain in the country without fear of deportation, which is huge. So these folks qualify to work, travel abroad, apply for their spouse or children under the age of 21 to join them. And this is possible because of the Refugee Act of 1980. So it's been around for a while. During different administrations, folks may kind of just come in and out of being able to be eligible for being granted asylum. But so far it's holding pretty strong. And a lot of the folks that we might be working with may not qualify to work or travel abroad or apply for their spouse or children under the age of 21 to join them. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. The last one in this column is temporary protected status, also known as TPS. This is, as the name suggests, a temporary benefit that is granted to eligible foreign-born individuals who cannot return safely to their country of origin due to an ongoing armed conflict, environmental disaster, epidemic, or other extraordinary and temporary condition. Folks that are TPS holders are protected from deportation based on immigration status and are eligible also for employment and travel authorization. On the next column, you'll see at the very top, immigrant family. And this is a word that most people are very familiar with. This is any family with at least one parent born outside of the country of residence. I personally identify as having an immigrant family. Secondly to that, you've heard of me say this word before when I've identified myself as somebody that has previously held a green card. This is lawful permanent residence, and that is a foreign-born individual who has been granted the right to reside permanently in the United States. A lot of this time, it is mostly because of different works. So people that are known as lawful permanent residents are also known as permanent resident aliens and also green card holders. And you will most likely hear green card holders more often so than the other two. The last one in this column is student with interrupted formal education, also known as SITE. Students in grades 4 through 12 who have experienced disruptions in their educations in their native countries and or the United States and or are unfamiliar with the culture of schooling. So this may be a lot of folks that you work with. You may identify a lot of students as somebody that has this sort of interrupted formal education. So now that term is here for you to just kind of keep in your brain and use whenever you need to. This is the last slide that we'll be saying on shared terminology. We'll begin with discussing DACA, also known as Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And this is an administrative relief program that protects from deportation and provides a work permit to eligible individuals who migrated to the US as children. DACA recipients are sometimes referred to as DACA-mented. It is likely that folks may work with a lot of DACA recipients, but a lot of the times people don't advertise this identity very much. Beyond that, we also have on the very bottom unaccompanied minors. And I've heard from many folks here today that they do a lot of work with unaccompanied minors. And this is an individual that is under the age of 18 who entered the US without lawful status and also without an accompanying parent or legal guardian. Oftentimes, unaccompanied minors are paired with sponsors, which is the third of the column and also the last of it. And a sponsor, we're going to refer to sponsor right now as a verb first. And to sponsor an immigrant is the traditional term for petitioning. the person to come to the United States. So you would be initiating a process that allows the immigrant to apply for legal admissions and or status by virtue of a family relation to the sponsor. Sometimes it's not necessarily a family relation, sometimes it is, but most likely unaccompanied minors are paired with sponsors, and sometimes whole families are as well. So it is important also to get to know the sponsor family or the sponsor guardian of the unaccompanied minor or the whole newcomer family so that you can properly communicate and communicate more generally everything that you want to say. Sometimes words might get lost, sometimes communication isn't necessarily holistic, but that is also a very important term to know. On the last column that we have to the right, we have refugee family. These are migrants that are seeking entry into a country who can demonstrate that they have been persecuted or have reason to fear persecution on the basis of 1 to 5 protected grounds. Number 1, race. Number 2, religion. Number 3, nationality. Number 4, political opinion. And lastly, membership in a particular social group. So this is the wording that we are also focusing on pretty largely today. The video is also focused mostly on refugee status. So you'll be hearing a lot of this in the future as well. Second to that, we have undocumented immigrants, and this is an individual residing in a given country without legal documentation. Undocumented immigrants includes folks that enter the US without inspection and proper permission from the government, and those who entered with a legal visa that is no longer valid. So a lot of folks that enter this way may be also fearful of, you know, formal buildings, federal or state buildings, official buildings, or any sort of space that they may be taken advantage of if folks realize that they do not have legal documentation. Sometimes undocumented immigrants are in a family with US citizens. So it is also important to note that in context to mixed status family, which is the last definition that we'll be going through today. A more formal definition of that is a family whose members have legal statuses, including undocumented immigrants, DACA recipients, TPS holders, lawful permanent residents, as well as US citizens. So I know that was a lot of information, but it is necessary to go through all of this so that we just have generally immigrants, statuses, terminologies, some basic knowledge and foundation of laws and how that relates all to each other and how it connects so that in the future, when we're looking at different types of strategies and content, it's easier to understand where we're standing, where our families are standing, and best practices to help them. Okay. So before I move on to language access and cultural sensitivity, however, I just want to take a step back and just go through everything that we've done already. Okay, we went through a lot. We first began by introducing and analyzing the belonging diagram, which we'll be using throughout the series. We then looked at the intersections of the diagram and discussed examples of how a flow could work for different milestones and how each of these milestones are not necessarily prioritized over the other because all are equally important and necessary to creating a sense of belonging. Next, we went through the milestones, understanding context through a look at history, demographics, and a brief look at systems. And from our presentation so far on this context, we know currently what current demographics in Massachusetts and the state as a whole looks like. We also know that there are systems and laws in place for schools to support newcomer families and students in registering for schools without needing paperwork. Organizations that have established support networks for English and multilingual support, and also ways provided by state resources for folks to engage in culturally sustaining strategies within classrooms. Lastly, we did a whole thing on shared terminology and it did a couple of just basic terms that we'll be needing to remember in the future as well. Okay, so now that we've spoken on all of that, let's talk a little bit more on language access and cultural sensitivity before we begin looking at before we begin doing a quick breakout room on what this looks like and what this means in terms of your own districts. So when we're talking about language access and cultural sensitivity, which we'll dive a little bit more in depth into later on in session 3 and 4, we are speaking on really just humanizing the education process for as much as we possibly can. This is very difficult to do sometimes, especially when the systems that are set in place are very rigorous and hard to, really adapt to what you need at the moment. But I provided a couple of questions for folks to think through in regards to language access and cultural sensitivity, while keeping in mind that the lens that we're looking through this is really how to humanize the process for everybody. So we first begin with asking ourselves, what do students need in and out of the classroom? What should schools provide? How can schools and families cultivate and practice community engagement? And lastly, how can educators foster and deepen relationships with newcomer families? These are all questions that we are answering intermittently and throughout the series and beyond that in April and May. But a lot of this work cannot be personalized to each district because everybody is going through different scenarios. So what we can do, however, is provide examples of strategies and provide spaces for folks to come together, network, and just kind of think more critically on what strategies mean in terms for your own accessibility, your newcomer families access, what languages they speak, and what cultural sustainability looks like in your environment. So looking at that, I would like to bring up just the first example that you see on the slide, utilizing translanguaging in EL development. Due to time constraints, I think this is probably the one that we should be focusing on as an example before we go and move on into breakout rooms. But the term translanguaging that I'd like to just define for everybody today is broadly the efforts to move across and beyond language boundaries by emphasizing how multilingual individuals can use their language abilities to strategize on how to communicate effectively. So this may mean committing to cultural brokering, translators, all that stuff, but also providing opportunities for student peers to develop these linguistic awareness, both in the classroom and outside of it, so that folks do not just communicate within their circles. So this is one strategy that I'd like for folks to just kind of figure out and think in mind of while we're talking about language access and cultural sensitivity. But I like to take this time to step down, stop talking, and let everybody have a chance to just kind of connect with folks before we move on to the last ending parts of this presentation and also our asynchronous work time. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second, pause the recording, and also just sort everybody into different breakout rooms. In the breakout rooms, I am going to be sharing a Jamboard. I would like for folks to take a look at the a list of ways to integrate belonging into the classroom through strategies and also the diagram. And think of 1 to 2 ways that you have been able to do so, or that ways that you are able or want to do so in the future. I'm going to stop recording now.